Welcome to the worship services of the First United Methodist Church, located at the head of Texas Street in downtown Shreveport, Louisiana. Join Senior Minister Dr. Stephen Bell as we worship this morning.
Will you pray with me? Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Amen. It was a beautiful day in Capernaum. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, the smell of falafel and hummus filled the air. Off in the distance, the Sea of Galilee was so still, it looked like a glass mirror. The fishermen were casting their nets, and the women were preparing for the Shabbat, the Sabbath dinner. There had been talk of a rabbi, a teacher, who had been traveling through the region of Galilee, teaching in synagogues and announcing the good news of the kingdom of heaven. He healed every kind of disease and illness. People from all over were bringing their sick and their hurt. Everyone desperately wanted to meet this man. That morning, there was a lot of scuttlebutt. Hundreds of people were walking through the village to the mountain. And then there he was, the teacher, the rabbi, Jesus. Everyone dropped their flatbread and followed the crowd. He stood high on the mountainside, a group of 12 men standing closest to him. The crowd stopped further down the mountain toward the sea, his voice bellowing into the hills that formed the shape of an amphitheater. And he began to teach. The crowd hung on every word. He spoke the Beatitudes, and then about salt and light. He taught on the law of Moses, and then about anger, adultery, and divorce. He spoke with such authority, as if he was God. And then he said this, "But to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other cheek also." Things I wish Jesus had never said. Things that I wish Dr. Stephen Bell had never asked me to preach on. Number one, love your enemies. Every time I read this portion of the Sermon of the Mount, my eyes squint and my ears perk, and I do this double take thinking, I'm sorry, what did you just say? Love your enemies, turn your cheek? You have got to be kidding me. Is there any way I can get out of this and still be considered a follower of Christ? Give me a loophole. The insensitivity of Jesus is all the more striking when you hear his follow-up suggestions or commandments. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Wait, we not only have to love our enemies, but now we have to pray for them too? And I suppose this doesn't mean the sort of prayer that says, "Dear Lord, change my enemies so that they'll stop being so mean to me." That's a prayer for me, not my enemy. When Jesus commands us to pray for our enemies, we're meant to ask for God's blessing on them. Yes, you heard that right. Jesus wants us to ask that good, not evil, fall on our enemies. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't want to love my enemies. In my worst moments, I want to hurt them or gossip about them or undermine them or generally make them pay. In my better moments, I simply want to ignore them or sideline them or ostracize them. If I can't retaliate, maybe somebody else will, and then I can enjoy the warm satisfaction of knowing that they'll finally get what they deserve. Right? But no, Jesus said that none of that behavior is an option for his followers. And even more than that, none of those desires are an option for his followers. If we want to follow Jesus, we cannot hate others, even the others who hate us. Now, I've spent a lot of time trying to twist and turn this passage. I try to justify it and butcher it to make it fit nicely into my theology. I love it because it sounds like utopia, but I hate it because I know that if I were to follow this command to love my enemy, I'll likely get hurt in some way. Honestly, why would Jesus say such a thing? I think it may begin with that first word, love. The word love appears 551 times in the NIV version. Oh, you guys are reading along in your sermon notes. There's a quiz in your sermon notes. The word love appears 551 times in the NIV version of the Bible. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor. Love one another. Love your enemies. The Greek word for love here is agape. Agape is unconditional love. It's the kind of love that translates to mercy and charity. It's the love of God to man and for man, of man for the good of God. One scholar explained agape this way: to will the good of another. Will the good of your enemies. Will the good of those you do not like. Will the good of those who speak against you. Will the good of those who want what you want or take what you have. Will the good of those who seek to harm you. Will the good of those who persecute you. But how do we do this? How do we will the good in others? I often tell people that if you spend more than 5 minutes in conversation with me, I'll likely work one of three things into that conversation: Jesus, missions, and Quakers. Today is your lucky day because you're going to get all three. A year ago, many of us were in Ramallah, Palestine. This is a place I had been dreaming of going since I was a child. You see, in Ramallah, there is a school. A Quaker school. The Quakers began serving in Palestine in 1869, and the school has withstood the test of time through the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate, the Jordanian rule, the Israeli occupation, and now the Palestinian National Authority. It's even withstood yearly rockets and bombings, which begs the question: how has the school endured 150 years of conquering and conflict? The answer? It's made loving its enemies its number one testimony. Ramallah Friends School is a beacon of light in the rubble of its community. Its leaders and teachers seek to will the good of those around them by cultivating an oasis of hope, a sacred space of transformational love and resilience. As we walked down the hallway touring the school, we heard personal testimonies of how the teachers had been treated, especially as they crossed to and from Israel. We listened to story after story of turning the other cheek and loving those who hate them simply because of their zip code or their school address. How can they possibly extend agape love? How do they will the good in those who hate them? Well, each time I asked that question, the answer was the same: SPICE. Yes, you heard me right, SPICE. We Quakers have an acronym, SPICE, to remind ourselves of the life Christ calls us to imitate, especially when loving our enemies. So we're going to spend some time unpacking that acronym today. Are you ready? Okay. S, simplicity. I don't know about you, but I tend to complicate things. I hear the commandments to love God and to love others, and I look for a chart or a handout. It can't be that simple. There has to be more. Our memory verse for this week, which is printed in your bulletin, is from Romans chapter 5, verse 8. Paul writes, God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I love this verse because it simply reminds me that love is from God. He revealed his love by sending his Son into the world so that we can live through him. There's nothing we can do to earn God's love. I'm a sinner, and in my sin, I separate myself from God. And through that sin, I become God's enemy. But instead of condemning me, God welcomed me. He sent his Son to die for me. That's the greatest gift I have ever received. If God so lavishly loves us, then the least we can do is love each other. It's that simple. My favorite author, Henry Nouwen, coined the phrase, "The Christ in me sees the Christ in you." Or another way of saying that would be, my brokenness sees your brokenness. Love and forgiveness go hand in hand. What if I loved my enemy with the same grace and forgiveness that God offered? What if we gifted and blessed our enemies with love? How can we seek to love each other as Christ loves us? So S is simplicity, P is peace. Everything that Jesus taught was grounded in the teachings of the Old Testament law. The Torah required that Jews treat all people, even foreigners that lived in their land, as they would treat their fellow Israelites. The Golden Rule was taught by all the great rabbis because to treat others as you would like to be treated is a universal law. The idea behind it is this: if I don't extend peace, who will? If I don't start living my life by willing the good of another, who will? If every moment of my life is dedicated to getting the best only for myself, where does that leave the rest of the world? In 2011, I was living in Haiti and installing solar-powered clean water systems. My home was a monastery in the mountains south of Port-au-Prince, and I would take week-long trips from the monastery to check on our water systems around the country. And this particular time, I was staying in a small village up in the north of the country, and I was saddened to learn that the community was living in fear of a voodoo priest. Every night, I would go to sleep listening to this loud banging of drums and loud chanting. One morning, I woke up with the roosters that had been cock-a-doodle-dooing all night long, and I woke up and I opened my door, stumbled into the courtyard, and saw a dead chicken on my doorstep. Come to find out, the voodoo priest had killed that chicken, spilled its blood over my door, and written a curse. Now, I had never seen anything like this before, and I was more than a little freaked out, as you can imagine, and I was ready to give the voodoo priest a piece of my mind. The pastor where I was staying, though, taught me a valuable lesson. In that same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Because of the fall, we live in a divided, conflicted, hate-filled world with angry and broken people, but we each carry the stamp of God's creation. And because of this, we're called to promote peace with our enemies and our neighbors. We're called to acknowledge in our lives those emotions and attitudes and prejudices which lie at the root of destructive conflict. We're challenged to pave a path that brings peace and dignity and respect to all people. So what did we do? Instead of retaliation, we surprised that voodoo priest with love and peace. We fried up that chicken, said a blessing over the priest and his family, and served a meal to the whole community. There's more to that story if anybody ever wants to know that. So S is simplicity, P is peace, I is integrity. Paul writes to the Ephesians, "Instead, we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ. So stop telling lies. Let us tell our neighbors the truth." Quaker integrity translates this, "Let your word be your word." Our actions and our words must reflect our Christian testimony, even when it's hard. One of the lessons I've learned traveling all over the world is that in many cultures, it's very acceptable to mislead your enemies and your friends in order to come out on top. It's justified with the thought, "Oh, I don't want to offend you, so I'll just tell you what you want to hear." Because of this mindset, I think I've spent much too much time in Uganda and Ecuador, Haiti, and even the United States of America discussing cultural norms versus the gospel message. Yes, I want to be sensitive to understanding your culture and your context, but yes, I also want to be authentic to biblical teachings. So I continue to pose the question, at what point does the gospel message trump cultural norms? Living with integrity is not easy, but Jesus did not die on the cross for us to live comfortably and easily. As disciples, we're called to live authentically and truthfully and honestly, and to integrate our values into our actions. Jesus taught us to live counterculturally in the upside-down world of the gospel. When the world tells us otherwise, we're challenged to love our enemies. Isn't that what agape love is all about? To will the good in others. So C is community. In John 15:12, Jesus says, "My command is this, love one another as I have loved you." A few years ago, in the midst of my dissertation research and writing, I was attending a worship service at Desmond Tutu's church in Cape Town, South Africa. The priest used a Zulu term, Ubuntu, in his sermon. Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U. So of course, after the service, I had to ask what Ubuntu means. And the priest explained it this way: I am because we are. My humanity is inextricably bound up in yours. A person is a person through other persons. A light bulb went off in my head. I was neck deep in writing about cross-cultural partnerships, and this one word, Ubuntu, seemed to explain everything that I was missing. Community is at the core of who we are. We're created to be in relationship with God and relationship with others. Christ gives us the example to do everything for mutual benefit, not just ourselves. I think it's within relationships that we learn about who we are as individuals as we see our love in action through the eyes of another. Because of this, we need each other to learn and to grow and to live in authentic community. God uses different people every day of our lives, our friends and our enemies, to teach us and mold us through all seasons of life. This includes celebrating the joy-filled times with each other, and it especially includes walking through tension and bringing reconciliation with our enemies. So we had S is simplicity, P is peace, I is integrity, C is community, E, equality. Each of us are so important, not only to God, but to each other. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." We're all children of God. Every person is equally loved by God, regardless of male or female, creed, culture, color, or social status. When we begin to think that we're more important than another, we begin to participate in that continuous cycle that leads to death and destruction. Yes, some have different abilities, and yes, some have different gifts, but as the Apostle Paul writes to the Corinthians, all of us together are Christ's body. Each of us are a part of it. We're instructed to will the good in others, to live our lives in such a manner that all around us are better off because we're here. When Jesus says to love your enemies, he's encouraging us to find a way to change the direction of life. He's encouraging us to stop looking at those around us as enemies, and that includes loving people who don't look like us or act like us or have the same zip code as us or even think like us, people who annoy us or poke fun at us or even persecute us. As the director of the Ramallah Friends School said, I realized that we're really not enemies after all. We're just people with hopes and dreams, people that want a better life for ourselves and our children. We're all human beings loved by God. To love an enemy is to hope for mutual good. So friends, how do we this? How do we love our enemies? How do we love those around us who continue to do the very things that infuriate us? Well, of course, we can bathe ourselves in Quaker spice, simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. But how can we endure when we've tried everything else that we possibly can think of? I'll leave you with this one final thought. When I think I can take no more, I think of Jesus' words on the cross. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Even at the end of his life, in his final minutes of agony, Jesus extended grace. He asked the Father to forgive his enemies and to love them all the more. He asked the Father to love and forgive me. He asked the Father to love and forgive you. So when you feel your enemy has you on a cross, pause for a moment to think about Jesus himself and his greatest act of love. Jesus forgave everyone, not just the people that he liked and not just the people who thought he was the Messiah. He showed us that forgiveness is the deepest gesture of love and mercy. Forgiveness wills the good of those around us. So when you've done all that you can to love your enemies, imitate Christ. May you turn to God and ask him to love and forgive them until they too can see the light and pay it forward. Amen. Amen.
You've been worshiping with the congregation of the First United Methodist Church, located at the head of Texas Street in downtown Shreveport, Louisiana. We welcome you to join us in person next Sunday at 8:30 or 11 a.m. For more information about First United Methodist Church of Shreveport, please visit our website at firstshreveport.com.